So on the 5th of August 2025, Sonos released a new firmware for most of its recent speakers. Why do I say recent? Because they've decided to fork the firmware version between the new and the older speakers. So for the legacy version, it will stay at 86.0. The new firmware version for the newer speakers will be at 90.0. Now, the internet is saying that the sound is vastly improved for the speakers during the recent update. So let's investigate whether that is really the case. So as I've mentioned, there are some of the older products that Sonos has that works with the S2 app that will no longer receive the newer version of the firmware 90.0 onwards. So they'll be stuck at 86.0, but Sonos promises that the functionality will still be maintained. Now, why are they not updating those? Because the memory is limited to 256 megabytes and below, and they don't have voice capability, they don't have Bluetooth, and they are no longer in production. So what products are those? Those will include the Boost, the Connect M, the Play 1s, Play 3, Play 5s, the Gen 2 Play 5s, as well as the soundbars for the Play Bar and the Play Bass. For the subs, that will be the Gen 1 and the Gen 2 subs. For Symphonics, they are no longer going to be supporting the Gen 1 of the bookshelf and the Gen 1 of the table lamp. So this time round, I did the update and the update went very smoothly. It succeeded on first try, and that is not something that I can say for the last couple of years, but now it is actually updating smoothly and fantastically. So in your systems page, you will actually see that some of your older products are on 86 point something and the newer products will be 90 point something. Now let's talk about the changes, right? So as usual on my channel, I actually do frequency response sweeps where I measure the before and the after of making all these system changes. So there's this thing called placebo effect. So what is placebo effect? If somebody tells you that it is better, so your brain will actually trick yourself to think that it is better, even if it is not. So most people won't really be able to tell small changes in audio profiles unless it's equipment that you're very familiar with, or the material is something that you have listened to hundreds of times and you are very, very familiar with, and you know it inside out. But, well, Sonos didn't say it was improved, so there's no placebo effect to speak of, right? But, well, as with any firmware update, as with any software update, whenever you perform something like that, maybe you're already telling yourself that something is getting better, so you are tricked into telling yourself that it is better and feeling that it is better. But what is Sonos really saying? Now, initially, Keith from Sonos on the Reddit forums, he said there were no changes and, well, but then he went to check and he said, oh, wait, there are actually changes. Now, what has changed? So the internet is rife with comments saying that their sound system has improved and the bass is shaking the walls and rattling the doors. And Keith went to check and they said that there were changes in the DSP profile and how frequencies were being represented, especially on the lower frequencies between 20 and 500 Hz. Now, the only real way to find out whether these are meaningful changes is to do the frequency response sweep. So for frequency response sweep, I have a PC and a mic up my entire studio, and it will pick up the sound, right? So you'll play a series of frequencies from 20 Hz all the way to 20 kilohertz, and it will measure the response to see whether there are actual changes. So if you don't know about the technical details behind it, don't worry about it. I have actually captured it and I will show it in the curves so that we can go through together. So these are the curves that I have pulled up. Now the first curve here, the cyan curve, this is the Arc Ultra alone without pairing any Era 300 or without pairing any subs. So this is before the update. So on its own, you probably can't tell much, but it will be meaningful when I pull in the yellow curve. Now the yellow curve is the Arc Ultra, again on its own, after the update. So you can see some minor and small changes there, right? The sub bass seems to be a little bit more depressed than before, and the bass region would have seen a slight boost, right? Maybe about 120 Hz onwards to 250 Hz or so. Now the lower mid-range is reduced slightly, and the mid-range has been maintained. The upper, mid, and the higher frequencies are slightly depressed. So are these big changes? No, they are actually very small, mildly discernible differences, which most people will not notice unless you have a very keen ear or you're trained to listen out to the differences in these frequency ranges, which may be very, very small. So if you ask me whether I'll be able to pick out those differences, I would admit that unlikely I will be able to pick out those differences. So is it true that this is the placebo effect that people are talking about, right? There are no actual changes? Well, actually, initially I thought so. Then I thought, hey, wait a minute, I unpaired the Sub 4 from the setup. So what if I add the Sub 4 back into the Arc Ultra setup? And that is exactly what I did, and these are the results. So the first curve I'm going to be pulling up is the green curve here. Now the green curve represents the frequency response sweep for the Arc Ultra with a Sub 4 paired in, and this is before the update. Now if you compare this with the previous curves without the sub, you will notice that the bass and the sub bass region is of course highly lifted and hugely improved, right? Because of the sub, right? The sub lends its powers to the sub bass and the bass frequencies. Now the next chart that I'm going to be pulling up here, this line in red here, is the Arc Ultra with the Sub 4 after the update. Now, this is where the difference is. And this is actually where most of you should be noticing the biggest difference, because the sub bass and the bass have seen big improvements over the green. The green line is before the update and the red line is after the update. Now, the crossover seems to have shifted slightly. The bass region no longer sees the dip somewhere around at 110 Hz or so. So you'll see that the bass curve is actually tailing off a little bit more gently and smoothly. The mid-range is lifted in very, very significant ways, between 450 Hz and 2 kHz, and that's where the vocals live, especially male vocals, right? So the energy that you can hear from this region, the mid-range region, is actually very present here. Things will sound louder. The treble, as we suspected and we saw in the test with the Arc Ultra without the sub, would have been reduced from 3 kHz onwards. Now this chart, right, this change, it is not a mild change. So how does it affect the listening? So I ran through a few clips, a few testing clips for Atmos effects, and I went through some of the movies and I tested it out, right? So the listening, it is really now quite in your face. The bass and the mid-range is actually quite well lifted up. The sub bass is slightly subdued, but it is not something that I could tell immediately. Now, what is important to note is that because of the reduced treble response, you will find that maybe there's a little bit less air around the sound, right? Less presence, I would say. So the whole effect, the whole presentation of the Arc Ultra with the Sub 4, it is no longer subtle. It is truly in your face. It is as though the speech enhancement has been turned on, but I didn't turn on the speech enhancement. Everything is now in your face. A lot of it is quite centered. There is still some surround effect, and that I admittedly would say that Sonos Arc Ultra does a very good job. Even the original Sonos Arc does a very good job of that. But the bass is now really thumpy, right? So there's more emphasis on the mid bass, so it shifted some of these. So the crossover must have changed. So I suspect that the previous crossover was at about between 80 and 110 Hz or so because of the sound motion driver in the Arc Ultra. So they could put some more bass duties on the Arc Ultra itself. But I think this time round, they probably shifted the crossover frequency a little bit higher so that it smooths out that small little dip at 110 Hz. So I suspect that the crossover frequency may hit about 120, 125 Hz or so. So what this all means is that the sound presentation is now very strong, very present. And if you are familiar with it and you listen always at a regular volume, you may find that the regular volume is now sounding louder than before because there's so much more energy in the mid-bass region as well as the mids. So this is how I test equipment. This is how I test most of the stuff from Sonos. So if you are interested, do stay subscribed on this channel as I go through all of this. Now, there is a very strong suspicion. We are already in August of 2025, right? I do suspect that Sonos is likely to launch a new product soon, and I would say within about 2 months or so. So think about it, right? The last major product launch was the Arc Ultra and the Sub 4, and this was back in October of 2024. That's a good 10 months ago. Now, I will get to review the next new product, be it the Era 500 or the Beam Gen 3 or the Sonos TV streamer, the Pinewood, and even possibly a Sonos AV-M, which is going to be an update to the old aging Sonos M. So stay subscribed if you are interested in that. So if you found this helpful, subscribe and like the video so I know how to make more of these type of videos. If you really want to, you can super like the video, and there's a super thanks for a one-time contribution, and recurring monthly subscription is also available on my channel to help me keep this channel running. So I would summarize to say that this version of the software update, the player version firmware, 90 point something onwards, will actually be fit for purpose, and it should actually bring a bit more enjoyment to your sound, depending on what kind of sound profile you like. But I would say in general, it is good, and the sound is going to sound better, and it's going to impress your visitors to your home even more. So meanwhile, before the new product launch, check out one of my other videos that I've done. You know what? I'm probably gonna have to redo the best settings for the Arc Ultra, which I've done before if you see one of these videos, but I will update that and move that into a new video for the upcoming end of year. So I'll see you in one of those videos, and bye for now.